This has been absolutely the most difficult painting I have ever done, partially because there were a lot of plants and flowers to paint. But another reason is because I had to paint the color pink. Well, it was really a red poppy to be honest, but there were shades of pink in it, and that proved to be more troublesome than I thought it would. Hello and welcome, my name is Charles. I go by Bob, and I'm not your typical painter. And today I'm going to show you how I painted this particular red poppy. Whoa! Before we get started, I want to say how I previously did a 40-minute video on how to do several poppies and the plants as well. And honestly, I think that was too much for some people. So today, I'm just going to cut to just this one lonesome red poppy. It was also the most difficult one too, because it had pink. Anyway, I'm definitely going to talk more about it in the video, especially the colors I used. It involved lots of trial and error, but like always, the first step was the underpainting. And for the underpainting, I used a bright orange for the red poppies. There was some sunlight piercing through the fog, and I wanted to capture that with something very bright, so I thought orange would be perfect. And before I really started detailing the poppies, I focused more on the background and all the little plants, grass, weeds, and a bunch of other plants that I have no idea what they are called. But it was necessary to establish the background first before I started to paint the flowers, especially since they were the stars. After I felt I did enough for the background, then the nightmare began of painting the poppy. I first start by applying big bodies of color, but at the same time, I try to distinguish each petal. As I am applying the paint, I'm trying to correct the underpainting as well. I am reshaping the flower's petals, especially the outer edges. I use different variations of shapes and lines of different tones of red in order to help give the flower its shape and form. In a way, I'm setting myself up for detail later, but right now I am trying to distinguish the different petals of the poppy and also get a sense of how translucent each petal is as well. But the biggest challenge I had throughout this whole process was trying to mimic the pink I saw in the photo. I did not have the color pink readily available, so it was very challenging from the start to try to mimic it. That is why you will see throughout this video, I am constantly repainting each section. Yes, I did some research on the matter of how to create pink, but I refused to go with any other colors than the ones I already had. So the colors I used for this entire painting, at least for the reds, was cadmium red, yellow, and orange, as well as cadmium scarlet. But also, I used alizarin crimson for some of the deeper reds, as well as for the darks, mixed with either French ultramarine or Viridian. To get the pinks, it was a combination of titanium white mixed with red. But to get the different tones of pink, I would include orange and yellow in some scenarios, and for some of the cooler tones, cobalt blue. And instead of cadmium red, sometimes I used alizarin crimson. I did quite a lot of experimenting in order to try to pull off the illusion of pink. One of the things I did while painting was applying a lot of different lines of color. The brush strokes I applied were directional, and they followed the petals of the poppy. My goal was to try to capture the texture of the flower petals, and in ways, the shimmering sun too. I used almost pure titanium white with a tad bit of cadmium orange, especially for the very bright spots. Since the paint was wet during this stage, at times I applied pure colors into specific areas, such as alizarin crimson for the darks, and cadmium red or orange in order to change the tone of red or pink. I would also do some light dry brushing, but the goal was to make sure the brushwork was visible. In ways, I'm trying to show the fibers of each petal. Plus, the directional brush strokes help overall establish the form of the flower and the petals. And during the whole time, I paid attention to the lights and darks, as well as the borders of where the petals were, including the ones that were see-through. When it came to adding darks, I did not use black out of the tube. Instead, I relied on two different mixtures. One which was a Viridian and alizarin crimson dark, and the other was also alizarin crimson, but with French ultramarine blue, but with a tad bit of cadmium orange, especially in order to get the warmer dark tones. For some of the cooler darks, I would use cobalt blue, but when I'm applying the darks, I'm being very careful not to ruin the petals that were on the lighter, brighter side. Plus, I wouldn't want the colors to become muddy either. The hardest area where I was applying the darks was definitely the little folds on the petals. In order to create them, one of the techniques I did was apply the lights and darks next to each other and then gently dry brush to establish the illusion of the fold. Kinda like painting cloth, but for a flower petal instead. To help reinforce the folds, I would apply more color, whether it is to increase the darks or even the brights. As for little highlights, I wait till the end for that. Since the flower was definitely translucent, especially since the bright sun was piercing through the petals, I exaggerated the borders a bit of each petal by in a way creating somewhat of an outline, whether it is using a bright white with a tad bit of cadmium orange, or in some scenarios pure orange or pure red. The goal was to distinguish each petal on this poppy and ultimately give the illusion that it is translucent. But while doing all this, I'm also trying to be cautious not to eliminate the texture. Now I'm going to speed through this section because it is more of the same, which is building up layers of lines, dry brushing here and there, add some highlights and darks, and then repeat. What I'm doing is practically building more and more layers of brushwork. I also did a lot of experimenting while painting this poppy, especially trying to capture the illusion of pink. At one point, I kind of gave up and I said to myself, let the paint dry a bit and I'll come back to it later. Besides, I had 1,000 other plants in the painting I had to focus on too. And while working wet on wet paint has its benefits, especially the very subtle touches you could get, and while I didn't dry brush much, I did here and there to soften some of the brush strokes. But I figured, now it is time to layer over dry paint. So I took a break from working on the poppy and the other ones as well, and continued to work on the background a little more. In a way, I did not even touch the flower until the very end. And with the paint dry, I felt I could do a little bit more now, which leads to part 2. Painting wet over dry. After taking a break from the poppies and working on the background, it was now time to finish this poppy. Like mentioned before, there's some advantages of the paint being wet, but there's also disadvantages too. For example, it is hard to do sharp detail, but the main benefit is that you can continue to layer and the paint and color won't get muddy, especially with translucent layers. This is something that I felt was very necessary to do, especially if I wanted to pull off the illusion of pink. Like before, I am focused on building lines of color and trying to keep visible brush strokes in order to establish the texture of the petals. I am dry brushing lightly, but for the most part, I'm intentionally making my brushwork directional. Again, this is to help give the flower its shape and form and a sense of volume. But the biggest difference this time around is I'm trying to boost the contrast, more so on the highlights. Since the layer of paint on the poppy was dry, my titanium white mixture with a tad bit of orange stands out even more. Before, when I would apply it to the wet paint, it wouldn't be as sharp since it would softly blend in with the paint. In ways, this was kind of a tug-of-war battle, and like I mentioned before, an experiment. At times, I really felt like I was not making any progress, but at one point I felt like I was able to start controlling the colors I was using and getting the effect I wanted as well. Yes, I know this process was pretty much trial and error, and I did feel like I made lots of errors, but I was starting to like the effect I was creating from all the brush strokes of different colors next to each other, directionally forming the petals and flower. I'm gonna speed through the rest of this, but as you watch, just take note of all the layering I have done up until now and also towards the end. Yes, it was a tedious process and very repetitive as well, but I was trying to pull off the illusion of pink and at the same time keep some visible brushwork. It was definitely a trial and error process until I got the colors right. Once I felt like I established the color of the poppy, it was time to add the final touches. Little things such as defining the petals a little more, refining the delicate folds and curves of the flower, but most importantly, the lighting and how the sun shimmers, as well as pulling the illusion of the translucent qualities of the flower. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. Hopefully you found some value in this video on painting flowers They say every rose has its thorns. So do poppies. They have plenty. But the difficulties I had to do more about trying to paint pink. Did I get it exactly like the photo? Honestly, I don't think so, but I think I came very close. Anyhow, for more of my work, check out my Instagram. Not your typical painter, of course. Once again, my name is Charlambos. I go by Bob, and I'm not your typical painter. Until next time, bye.